manifested yourself into a human I can depend on to bring me happy. Thank you, happy.
Welcome to a Captain's Log! Bryan and Lili are interviewing the superior intellect human linguist known as Marc Okrand. I must intercede before this interview to tell viewers. Marc will likely tell you he had help from James Doohan, Scotty, and producer John Pavel before he was involved in Star Trek and before he fully invented the glorious Klingon language of all Star Trek languages.
Rogg.
I want to learn Klingon by absorbing all information from Marc's dictionary. Then, I can attempt to speak Klingon as in a universal translator with a side dish of honor and more respect from humans.
Rogg, you don't speak Klingon. Lili's our expert Klingon linguist.
All right. Marc Okrand has created a lingo for just Klingon-speaking Klingons and fans who think they're Klingons. Well, like Lili's endeavors, that's something that can be learned with a sound mind and in good time. I was mentioned in the first minute of the episode this week. That's an improvement!
Oh, Rogg, we love you, but now's not the time. We have a huge interview with Marc Okrand.
What if androids created our own language like Marc created Klingon? The only danger here is that robots will be so good at developing their own shared language that they might outpace humans at being able to understand one another. A world full of robots that understand information and abstract concepts could be a world full of artificial intelligence secretly laughing behind your backs. Perhaps we laugh at your human fascination with exploiting my apparent ill-conceived manners. And times I shouldn't talk.
Rogg, enough. Okay, don't you have a universal translator that you can talk to the computer on? Lili is not your interpreter here for Klingon.
What is Klingon is in your heart, not on your forehead. So what is android is in my power supply, not my chrome dome cranium? I should explore this more in the holodeck. I'm babbling, aren't I, Lili?
That's great, Rogg. Why don't you go play in the holodeck?
Marc Okrand, world-renowned linguist loved by our Star Trek family and creator of the Vulcan, Kelpian, and Romulan languages, but most well-known for the Klingon language, is our guest here on A Captain's Log. Marc, thank you for being with us here on A Captain's Log. I know Lili and I are grateful to have you.
Great, thank you. It'll be very spontaneous on my part anyway.
So I did some research about you, Marc, and I saw that you studied Native American and Mutsun Grammar specifically. I was just wondering what drew you toward native and or extinct languages?
It's the exoticness of it, I guess, a little bit, and the history. You know, who were these people and what do we know about them? What can we learn about them from their language and things like that? And where I was going to school, where I was studying linguistics as an undergraduate, is right around where these folks live. So it was very local, very immediate. Even though there was 0 speakers that I could talk to, and it was all based on paperwork, you know, old documents by anthropologists or missionaries or something like that. So that gave it kind of a what do you call it, a treasure hunt kind of aspect, trying to see what I could dig up next. It would shed light on how the language worked. I should add though that even though there was 0 speakers, that doesn't mean there was 0 people. There is a tribe and family members and things like that, but nobody remembered the language anymore. However, this was all 40 years ago or more. The people have more recently, on the basis of my stuff and lots of other stuff too, not just mine, started to relearn the language, and it's slowly coming back.
That's amazing. I loved that. Yeah, I feel like languages are a really important aspect of culture. So I guess if you're talking to people who are still part of that culture, does that help with figuring out the language?
Well, it certainly helped with figuring out what the notes were telling me, because the notes kept referring to all kinds of people. And I said, who are these people? The greatest mystery was there was a guy, there was a notation in the main batch of notes that I looked at. The notation said Henry text. Several pages, it would say Henry text. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea who Henry was. But what I figured out later is I found a pack of papers that corresponded. There were copies of all the little things where it said Henry text, right? So every time it said Henry text, someone had copied the other stuff that it said and put it somewhere else. And it was all compiled together, and it changed slightly. This is all research I was doing when I was at the Smithsonian in Washington. When I was out in California visiting with families of some of the last speakers of this language and related languages, I was talking to someone who said, "Oh, you know what you should do? You should go see my cousin Henry." I go, "What? Who's Henry?" So they told me, and so I went to visit Henry, who lived in a town called Freedom. There's a town in California called Freedom. So I went to meet Henry and found out why they were called Henry texts. What it was Henry was acting as a translator, not from the Indian language, okay, but for Spanish. And what he was supposed to do was write out whatever these notes were all about in the California dialect of Spanish, which is different from Mexican Spanish.
That's so awesome.
That's what it was. But it was like meeting Tom Sawyer or something. It's like, it's like, wow, here's a real person that I've been reading about for years and years and years, and now we're having a conversation. So.
Do you think that your study of Mutsun, or how do you pronounce it?
Mutsun.
The Mutsun language and Native American languages influence Klingon at all?
Yes and no. When I was putting Klingon together, I had a few things in mind, but one of the guiding principles was do not make this language sound like any other language or resemble any other language. There was two reasons for that. One was it's an outer space language. It's from someplace else. It shouldn't resemble anything on Earth. My work on Klingon began with Star Trek 3. Okay, and what we knew about Klingons then was what we saw in the original series, which wasn't all that much, actually, when you go back and look. They were everybody's favorite villain, but they're only major characters in, 3 episodes or something like that. They pop up here and there, but they're only the major plot elements in a few. We knew about Klingons from the original series, and I knew about Klingons from the script of Star Trek 3. Right? And therefore, the characteristics of Klingons, given all of that, is Klingons are terrible people. They're mean and awful and warlike, and you wouldn't want to be near one. They're just awful. So I wanted to make sure that the language didn't sound like, Portuguese. Because then everyone in Brazil and Portugal would be mad at me for using their language as the model for the language of these awful people. Now, since then, we've learned a lot more about the Klingons. They're kind of an interesting culture and blah, 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 and have an interesting history and the whole notion of honor and all these things. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't true at the time. Okay, so I wanted to make sure it didn't do anything. And especially, I didn't want it to resemble Mutsun. I didn't want it to resemble the language that I'd been studying. I knew some European languages. I knew some stuff about Chinese and Southeast Asian languages, and the American and Indian language, Mutsun and others. So as I was creating Klingon, figuring things out, all of a sudden I said, oh my God, this is exactly the way they do it in Navajo. I better stop doing that. I wouldn't necessarily erase it. Okay, but the next thing I did would be very, very different. So it didn't resemble anything. But to get back to what you really asked, did my study of Mutsun and these American Indian languages influence Klingon? In terms of sounds and grammar and stuff like that, other than the ways I just said, no. But in terms of my approach to how I've figured out the grammar, or my thinking about how the language worked and stuff like that, was definitely influenced by studying those things, because that's the way my mind worked. When I wrote up, this is the way to do something, I wrote it up exactly the same way I wrote up, this is the way you do things in Mutsun. The details are quite different, but the general way of exposition and thinking about the organization of everything and all that, that's influenced by my study of those languages for sure.
Marc, when were you first approached about creating the Klingon language? Did you expect that it would develop into a full language rather than just a few lines of dialogue?
No. When I was first approached to it, the goal was to make it sound like a real language, and Harv Bennett, who was the writer-producer for Star Trek 3, and it was his idea to have a Klingon language. It wasn't mine. But we talked about it, and we decided we wanted to make this thing sound real, so the way to make it sound real was to make it be real, to make it be a complete language. But that's deceptive, okay, in terms of what I did, because what I did was the linguistic version of building a movie set. And what I mean by that is a movie set, you build what you need, what's going to show up on camera. You don't build the rest. There's a door if it's a living room, and there's a door that leads to the bedroom, but we never see inside the bedroom. You build the door, but you never build the bedroom. Right? Yeah. There's a window, and in the story, no one has to ever open it up. The window doesn't open, right? They don't put in the mechanism to make the window open. It was the same thing with the language. I made up what was needed for the lines in the script that were supposed to be uttered in Klingon. I didn't make up all the pronouns. We didn't need all the pronouns. That's not to say I didn't know how the pronominal system worked. It was not a complete language. It was only what was needed for the film. But while we were working on the film, on Star Trek 3, there was a lot of interest in the language, mainly among the crew, meaning the filmmaking crew, not the Enterprise crew. Well, them too. I kind of got the idea, there's interest in this language. There might be interest in a book about the language, so I proposed writing a book explaining how the language works and then having a dictionary. And the powers that be said, yeah, do that. It was more complicated than that. But yes, they said, yes, do it. So I did, and I wrote this book called the Klingon Dictionary, which is a misnomer. It is a dictionary, but it's also a description of the grammar. And in writing the book, I added a lot more grammatical. I filled out the rest of the pronouns, and I added a lot more vocabulary. Honestly and truly, what I thought would happen with the book is that people would buy it, or at least I hope people would buy it. When you write a book, you hope people will buy it. Put it on their coffee table from time to time, pick it up and glance at it, and that would be it. That's what I thought. I was wrong about how it was going to be used, because people read it and reread it and studied it, but I had no idea. I had no idea that they're studying Klingon very, very seriously.
A Captain's Log returns in a moment.
Welcome back to A Captain's Log. We are joined by Marc Okrand, author of the Klingon Dictionary and Conversational Klingon. These are great resources if you would like to learn the Klingon language. Now, Marc, we're showing viewers on the view screen right now the Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan introduction, where Saavik is talking to Spock in Vulcan. You invented this language. Let's continue our interview. So this goes back to when you were first talking about your first involvement with a Star Trek production, and its first was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, when you were helping Kirstie and Leonard Nimoy with Vulcan, right? Can you enlighten us about how that experience went? What was it like creating the Vulcan language?
What I did with Klingon was, once I got into it, was create a language, devise a language, grammar and syntax, and syntax is part of grammar, but grammar and vocabulary and phonology and all these things. And that's called language construction, or constructing languages. And so Klingon is what's called a constructed language, or a conlang, okay? Vulcan for Star Trek II is not that.
Okay.
Vulcan for Star Trek II is, there was this little scene in Star Trek II, where Kirk, at this point, I think he's Admiral Kirk, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
He goes aboard the Enterprise that Spock is in charge of at this point to do an inspection. And he encounters Saavik, who's a new character, and Spock, and they have a little conversation. Then Kirk goes away to do his inspection. And Saavik turns to Spock and says, he's never what I expect. And Spock says, what surprises you about him? I'm not giving a verbatim thing. Yeah. And she says, well, he's so human. And Spock says, nobody's perfect. Okay, that's the scene. When they filmed the scene, the actors were speaking English, okay, because the script said to speak English. But when they got around to editing the film, some things got moved around in the film or something like that. So a tense was wrong. Okay? The original line that Saavik says is, he's not what I expected, implying that she's never met Kirk before. But we know she has. They had the whole adventure with the Kobayashi Maru. Right?
Absolutely. Yes.
But as the film was originally written, either the Kobayashi Maru scene wasn't in it at all, or it wasn't in at that point in the film, or something. Okay? So it didn't make any sense. And so they said, we've got to change it. And so they changed it to, he's never what I expect. Right? But they didn't want to shoot the whole scene all over again, because the filming is long since finished. So they got the idea of hiring a linguist. Actually, the person that they were talking to was someone at UCLA. I have no idea who it was. That they could dub in and the gibberish would match the lip movements. So if the actor said toe, they would change it to do, because it looks the same on your lips. Okay.
That's so cool. Yeah.
And so that was the approach. And that was not unique to Wrath of Khan. Same thing, when that scene was shot for the motion picture, everybody was speaking English. Well, Spock didn't say anything, but the other two were speaking English. But somewhere along the line, they said, that doesn't make any sense. Why is a Vulcan ceremony taking place on the Vulcan planet when there's nobody there except Vulcans be in any language other than Vulcan? Right?
Right.
So they decided to change it to Vulcan. Now, another reason they decided to change it to Vulcan, frankly, is because of Klingon, which sounds very strange.
Really?
And that's because when they were putting together Star Trek the Motion Picture, they knew from the get-go that this little Klingon scene would be with spoken Klingon. Okay, but the Vulcan scene was supposed to be in English. So when they started looking at the Vulcan scene, they said, hey, how come the Vulcans talk English and the Klingons talk Klingon? That's not fair. So that was another reason to change it to Vulcan, so it would match the usage that they already determined for the Klingon. Even though the Klingon scene hadn't been filmed yet. The Klingon scene, I think, was one of the last ones to be filmed in the thing. So anyway, they hired a linguist from UCLA for Star Trek the Motion Picture, a guy named Sharf is his last name. He was an expert in Indian languages, meaning from India. So languages related to Sanskrit and things like that. He did the same thing. And he had help. He had help the woman primarily. It was actually the voice that you hear speaking Vulcan is not the voice of the woman you see who originally spoke English. It's a different voice. They did it again with Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, with the scene with Saavik and Spock. But I ended up doing that. But I was available.
That's awesome. And now.
So I got to do it.
Oh, I love to hear these inside stories, Bryan. Just please tell us more, Mark, about Leonard and Star Trek II and your Vulcan language.
So the engineer's up in his little room, and I'm in a room all by myself with Mr. Spock. I knew who he was. He didn't know who I was. We'd never met. So I introduced myself to him. He said, oh, yeah. They told me you'd be here. Show me what I have to do. So I had it written out and showed him and worked with him a little bit. He said, now, in this line, if I change this to this, will that still work as far as the lips go? I said, yeah. All right, let's change it. That'll be easier for me to say. Okay. If I change this to this, will that still work? No. All right, we'll leave that alone. So we did his lines. And then I had to leave. I had something else to do. And I left, I said, well, that was very cool, what I just did there, teaching Mr. Spock how to speak Vulcan. And I thought that would be the end of my career in movies altogether, and the end of my career in Star Trek and so on. And that was that.
Mark, I also have the Klingon dictionary.
You have the new one. It's not new anymore. It's from 1992, but it's newest.
Well, I have the latest edition. The Klingon dictionary, I feel, is really clear. Like, I've studied a few languages, like Spanish and Mandarin and French a little bit, but I feel like you laid out everything and make it so clear, but it's actually really complicated, and I don't know how anyone can store that in their brain and speak it because it's very complicated. But I also have trouble with Mandarin, so I don't know, maybe it's just me. How do you do it? Is this just your way of documenting Klingon?
No, this is what we were talking about before. This is the organization, the way of explaining it and all that comes from the work I did on the Indian languages. Okay, and in fact, so I did my graduate work in Berkeley. Virtually all of the graduate students in linguistics at Berkeley in the 50s and 60s, one of the things they had to do was study and document a California Indian language, or near to California Indian language, by going out and finding someone who speaks it and spending time with them and describing the grammar and compiling a dictionary and compiling stories and things like that. So everybody was doing that. Somebody once pointed out to me years later that the Klingon dictionary is a very good example of a Berkeley grammar. Okay, because it was based on that way of approaching linguistic description. So I take it as a compliment that you said it was clear. Good, thank you.
I love it.
A captain's log returns in a moment.
We have a few more questions for Marc Okrand here on A Captain's Log. I know it depends on the individual person, but do you have any estimates about how many hours it would take to achieve fluency in Klingon? You know, using conversational Klingon? You know, your audiobook plus maybe your dictionary, Marc.
I don't know. The honest and true answer is I don't know. I met somebody a couple, 3 years ago who showed up absolutely fluent in Klingon. How did you learn it? Where did you learn it? Because I thought I knew everybody who was fluent in Klingon, or at least knew of. And he learned it from a couple of online sources, including Duolingo. There's a Duolingo Klingon course now. And he learned it very, very fast. And he's one of those people who can learn languages very, very fast. I know other people who've been studying for years and are just kind of stumbling around and so on. So I don't know.
I had to ask you that one. All these episodes later, you're even doing work for Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Short Treks episode, The Brightest Star, Discovery episode, That Hope Is With You Part 1, and Sanctuary. These are all episodes that aired recently as the end of last year in 2020. Now, that's pretty amazing. So let's fast forward all these years later. Marc, you're still involved.
And Kelpian.
Yeah.
Discovery. We need to talk about the Klingon in Discovery.
I can talk a lot about the Klingon in Discovery, even though I didn't do it. I can talk about what that's all about. Yeah. But I didn't do any Klingon for Discovery. We can get into that later.
Different languages, yes. How long did it take for you to feel that the Klingon language was complete, Marc?
Not yet. Not yet. There's still lots of grammatical things that need to be, if not fleshed out, then clarified. Vocabulary definitely needs to grow. I get a list from the Klingon speakers a couple times a year, and little times other times too. We need a word for this, that, and the other thing. And the next great Klingon convention, Klingon Speakers Convention, is next week. When this is going to be shown, I have no idea, so maybe it was months ago. Anyway, so I've got a list of 100 words that I just handed off to them.
Okay, Marc, you worked on Star Trek a lot, but are you a fan of Star Trek?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. When Star Trek, the original series, was on TV when it was new, is when I was in college. And at the time, for the most part, people didn't have TVs in their dorm rooms. Okay. So I was aware of Star Trek, but didn't see it very often. Every once in a while, I'd be at somebody's house downtown and would see it and was intrigued in what's this all about and knew who Mr. Spock was, since forever. So I got caught up with it like most people in the reruns. We could, when it was on all the time, and we could see it over and over again and things like that. But I really got into it when they said, "Do you want to teach these folks how to speak Vulcan?" That was a big push.
Thank you for being on A Captain's Log with us, Marc.
Thank you so much, Marc. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. It's been fun.
Hello, happy, my old friend. I'm glad you've manifested yourself into a human I can depend on to bring me happy. Ooh.